This week on Quadriga, Ukraine. Can the country come together? Following the fall of President Yanukovych, Ukraine faces huge challenges. Ukraine is all but bankrupt and relies on help from outside the country. Fundamental reforms are needed to embed democracy and combat corruption. At the same time, the society is deeply divided between those who look to Moscow and those who see their future in Europe. The country could split over that issue. Alexander Turchinov has been installed as interim leader until presidential elections are held on the 25th of May. In the meantime, will Russia allow the process of change to proceed? And how much support will come from the European Union? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Calls for secession in Crimea, Russian troops on high alert. Ukraine could still spark the sharpest confrontation between East and West since the Cold War. So what will it take to bring the country together? That's what we want to talk about today with three people who've been following events in Ukraine very closely. And I'm very pleased to welcome Irina Solanenko. She is a researcher at the European University Viadrina. Originally from Ukraine, she previously worked there with NGOs, including George Soros' Open Society Foundations. And Alexander Rahr, he's one of Germany's foremost experts on Russia, formerly head of the German Council on Foreign Relations Beitz Center for Research on Russia, Ukraine, and Central Asia. He's also on the steering committee of the Petersburg Dialogue, which promotes understanding between German and Russian civil society. And finally, it's my pleasure to welcome Moritz Gatmann. He's been reporting on the countries of the former Soviet Union for over 10 years. During the 2009 Ukrainian elections, he traveled with presidential candidate Viktor Yanukovych, and he has just returned from reporting on the Maidan protests in Ukraine. Irina Solanenko, the acting president of Ukraine, has said he is very worried about the risk of separation, of possible secession. Is he right to be? How grave is the threat?
Yeah, there is such a threat when we talk about Crimea, not about the whole of Ukraine, but only in Crimea. We see now that the situation is very unstable. Some unknown people have just occupied regional administration, public buildings. But yesterday, we should remember there was a big demonstration of Crimean Tatars. We have like 250,000 Crimean Tatars in the 3 million population of Crimea. And they're also quite active and they want to stay within Ukraine. So they demonstrated in support of territorial integrity of Ukraine.
Moritz Gatmann, we also talk about this as if it's very black and white, the division, as if all Eastern Ukrainians think one way and all Western ones another. Is that right, or is there mixed sentiments throughout the country?
First of all, the situation on Crimea is really different from the rest of the country. But concerning the rest of the country, I would say there is also a division between the generations, between the older generation, which was brought up during the Soviet Union, and they are usually a bit more not exactly pro-Russian, but they have strong cultural ties also with Russia. Concerning this division between the West and the East, today and yesterday we heard calls from intellectuals from the East and from the West who are calling for a policy of the new government that will not deepen the division, especially concerning the language question, because that is a very strong and important question. But we will talk about this.
Alexander Rahr, we just heard it depends on the generation. Ultimately, is that then an ethnic issue? The fact is Crimea is a majority ethnic Russians. Is that what makes it so different from the rest of the country?
Yes, it's true, because Crimea never belonged to Ukraine until the 50s, when the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Khrushchev, at that time gave it to the Ukrainian Republic.
Give us a brief background on that history, because that intrigues me. Why did Russia decide to give it back?
It was part of the Soviet Union. Nobody was thinking of giving it to Ukraine. It was an administrative strike, because for some kind of political administrative reasons. But the Crimea did not, from its mentality, became part of Ukraine in the time of the Soviet Union. That changed in '91 when Ukraine inherited the new leaders in Ukraine. The democratic leaders inherited the entire Ukrainian republic, which had been in that form in the Soviet Union. But on Ukraine, in Crimea, you have a very strong ethnic Russian population of, I think, almost 60%. And about 25% are Ukrainians and 12% Tatars. And I think that the rifts between the Ukrainian-Russian population and the Tatars is also very big, because the Tatars were a very small minority a couple of years ago, but now they are enlarging themselves, their minority there. So the tensions had been created already a couple of years ago. I think it's a very tense situation, but I think that everything depends on how the government will act. This completely, I agree with what Moritz Gartmann and what you said, because if the government becomes a government of consent, if the government will refrain from doing that kind of laws which they endorsed a couple of days ago, prohibiting the Russian language as a state language in the eastern parts of Ukraine, they could do it, but not in this situation, I would say. And of course, they have to give the Russian ethnics, there are about 20 million ethnic Russians living in Ukraine, and the feeling that they are part of Ukraine, that they are Ukrainian state citizens.
So we want to talk about that in just a minute, whether the government looks to be in a position to handle the conflicts. But first, let's take a closer look at the Crimea. We do have a short report.
Supporters and opponents of the political changes in Ukraine clash in the Crimean capital, Simferopol. Ethnic Russians, who make up 60% of the population of the Crimea, are concerned about their future. Some are talking about splitting from the rest of the country.
We want a free Crimea, if necessary an independent one. We don't want to bow to that gang from western Ukraine who are in power now.
In Sevastopol, where Russia's Black Sea Fleet has its main base, ethnic Russians have been signing up to join vigilante groups. They say they want to defend themselves against radical elements in the opposition. Relations between Ukraine's different groups have become increasingly polarized. One more problem for the country's new leaders to address.
Irina Solonenko, those pictures look troubling indeed, and we've seen one mayor already pushed out of office in favor of a Russian-speaking mayor. Are you expecting violence in Crimea?
Well, I hope it will not come to that, but we see the situation is very tense. But we have to remember that a lot of people in Crimea and those Russian people, they have a lot of Soviet sentiments. They remember the Soviet times when there were a lot of recreation sanatoriums, and they could work in the sanatoriums. So this recreation facilities, infrastructure was very well developed in the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet Union broke up, privatization process started. A lot of people privatized land near the seashore. So of course many people are left out of business, if you want, and they don't have much income. So they have this kind of sentiments, but I'm not sure they really understand what it implies, having Crimea as a separate territory, whereas being a part of Ukraine and probably moving closer to the EU, where you have certain standards, rule of law, free justice. Maybe this is what they want really, but they don't understand that TV is also a big part of the problem, I think, in Crimea. There's a lot of Russian TV, it's not very objective. That's also a problem.
Meanwhile, we have extremely contradictory, or at least somewhat confusing statements coming out of Russia itself, Alexander Rahr. We have one Russian lawmaker saying Russia is certainly going to protect its compatriots in Ukraine, in Crimea, if there is violence. Then earlier in the week, we heard very angry rhetoric, then somewhat more moderate tones coming out of Moscow. And now suddenly Russian troops are on high alert along the border to Ukraine. Make sense of it all for us. To what degree would you expect a potential Russian intervention here?
I don't expect a Russian intervention, neither in the Crimea nor in the eastern parts of Ukraine. That's point number one, because Russia understands that this will provoke a third world war with the West. Second, I think it's also a kind of signal to its own population. if Russia is saying that they will protect the interests of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, because Russian society is shocked by what has been said. The same shock had been experienced here when we, before the Vilnius summit in October, where Ukraine was supposed to sign the agreement with the European Union and not with Russia, changed from one night to another and went toward the east and not toward the west. Then I remember also a lot of shocks in Poland and other countries here in the west, which were saying we have lost now Ukraine to Russia. So now the Russians have this kind of feelings.
So you're telling us it's for domestic consumption within Russia,
for domestic consumption but also think that that Russia put its troops on alert is I would say it's a normal thing. If you have a civil war or you have that kind of tensions in your neighboring country, for example, if Switzerland, I hope not, it never will happen, but would face such kind of problems as Ukraine is facing now, I'm sure that also the German government would set its troops in alert, because you don't know what will happen.
Moritz Gutmann, are you quite so sanguine? A lot of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow sounds rather like the kind of language we heard before Russian troops marched into Georgia some years ago.
But what we had in Georgia back then, that was really a military conflict. So it's rather hard to compare it with this situation, I would say. I would like to add that there are also some security questions concerning the army base of the Russian fleet on Crimea. We didn't talk about this so far. The Russians have their Black Sea fleet on the Crimea, and so the question of the Crimea is also a question of security of the fleet on Crimea. That's why the interest of Russia in the Crimea is quite understandable, I would say.
Irina Solonenko, how do you see it? Would you expect possible Russian military action, or is it just saber rattling and domestic politics?
I agree that Russian foreign policy in the near abroad is aimed for domestic consumption. And I have to add here that in mid-90s, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, there was an international memorandum signed by Russia, US, and other Western countries. And according to this memoranda, these parties have to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and Ukraine's sovereignty, independence. Russia signed this memorandum, and therefore it will be a violation of an international law if Russia introduces its troops. So I don't think it's happening, but of course there are a lot of people in Russia, also some civil society organizations, we may call them so, but they're not really civil society organizations, which are funded by Russia. And so I think Russia has some sort of agents in Ukraine which it can use to destabilize the situation. This is danger.
Alexander Ra, given that fleet based there in Crimea, how far would Russia let developments go before it would want to take some kind of action to make sure that it retains its influence there? At what point would Russia see a red line, do you think?
In my view, it would be a very big mistake if the Ukrainian government tomorrow or the day after tomorrow decides to throw the Russian fleet out of Sevastopol. What may happen? Then we have a next conflict. But I think they're sober enough not to do it in this situation, because the fleet also provides a lot of money to this area and gives people jobs and so on and so on. But you asked us to compare the situation with South Ossetia 5 years ago. Why did the war started? Okay, there are many theories still today. I think the war has started. Russia went into this, they found, of course, a pretext, went into the Georgian soil and start to fight Saakashvili, because Saakashvili started to kill Russian so-called, well, not so-called, they are peacekeeping troops, Russian official peacekeeping troops, which were attacked by the Georgian army, Russian citizens. So the war started because of that. If members of the Russian fleet will be physically attacked by some provocateurs, what I don't see today, then the conflict will be there. Then I think the Russians would have a pretext to go and safeguard their own fleet, fight back, but this is the worst case scenario which we can expect.
You all seem then to be of the opinion that we will not see a division of Ukraine take place through intervention from outside. Moritz Gottman, Russia had, however, been really pinning a lot of hopes on having Ukraine as the cornerstone of its economic Eurasian Union, a kind of Eastern version of the EU. Will Russia, do you think, be hoping that there still might be a split that would allow it to have at least a fragment of Ukraine as a cornerstone in the Eurasian Union?
I'd say that fragmentation of that state is not an option for Russia, and it's not an option to have half of Ukraine in the Eurasian Union, because that will mean a destabilization of that whole region, and that doesn't make sense politically and also economically. So the question of this Eurasian Union is still open. I would say that we won't see membership of Ukraine in this Eurasian Union, but I also doubt that we'll see a membership of Ukraine in the European Union, because we must not forget that this association agreement that the European Union is offering, it's not the first step to a membership, but it's a substitution of a membership in the European Union.
In 20 years, it may be the case.
Okay, let's say in the
10, 15 years.
In the next 20 or 25 years, we won't see Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union.
There are, of course, a lot of voices here in Europe saying Europe was way too slow last time around. It was way too cautious. It kept insisting that Tymoshenko needed to be released from prison before further integration could occur. Does the EU need to do a lot more, a lot faster now, Irina Solonenko, to make sure that Ukraine is stabilized? And should it even perhaps consider offering more than association, possibly membership?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure that EU has to act more decisively now, and it will be good to have a high-level group being set up in the EU. Maybe Angela Merkel could initiate it, and offer not just financial package, a short-term financial package, which Ukraine needs now. So there are different amounts estimated, but Ukraine now needs some help. And apart from that, maybe a signal of membership perspective, but not only for Ukraine, but also for Moldova and Georgia, because these countries have moved forward towards the European Union. There should be some more for more approach, I mean, which was set up at the EU level, but it should be respected, I think, because the countries made progress. And prospect of maybe visa-free travel, Moldova has already moved towards having it really very soon. Ukraine has to implement a few conditions, to vote for some laws and to implement them. It might take a few months if there is a political will, and then there is a pretty good reason for the EU also to open open visa-free travel. And on the association agreement, I would like to say that over 80% of EU's acquis communautaire, or 80% of acquis which candidate countries have to incorporate into national legislation to become members of the European Union, is inside of the association agreement. So basically, I think it's a step towards membership, because Ukraine will become de facto European country in terms of domestic standards, and that will make an issue of membership much easier to be put on the agenda.
So two aspects come to mind here in terms of what the EU can and should do. First one is, we've already seen so much tension develop along the lines of association. If the EU were to actually go further and offer potential membership, Alexander, what would that mean for ethnic Russians in Ukraine and for Russia itself? Would that not be a kind of a defiance that could provoke even more tension?
I think you want us to discuss rifts, like in the Cold War, between the West and Russia. I see it a little bit different. Also, of course, you have grounds and reasons to discuss it like that. First of all, three things I want to say. The European Union should now make a very important gesture to the Maidan and to the people who showed their adherence to Western values. Open the borders and give all Ukrainians the right to go to the European Union the same way as we can visit the Ukraine without visas. Point number one. And the European Union, in my view, will be measured. Its serious approach to Ukraine will be measured whether we are in Europe ready to do this step. Second, I agree with you to 80%. I think that the Eastern Partnership should develop association agreement with countries who would like to join the European Union, but the Eastern Partnership should be corrected. You named 3 countries or 4 who should become members of the European Union in the nearest future. I think that we cannot avoid also addressing Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, this country with the same approach. They should also have a perspective for Europe. The Russian association with the European Union will be another one than the Ukrainian association with the European Union. But the process of associating between Russia or the Eurasian Union and the European Union, in my view, is very correct, and we should try it. The best way is to start. Besides all this signing the partnership agreements with Ukraine and other countries who want it, we have to start a process of building a common economic zone from Lisbon to Vladivostok. It's not a nice word. I think it's a task for European unions to unite its continent. It will be more difficult with some countries, more easier with others, but we should do it.
So that is a tone that we have often heard called for in general. It shouldn't be either or. We need to be looking at this as how can we bring both sides together in a constructive way. But Moritz Gutmann, if we look at the facts on the ground, how feasible is any of that? Ukraine needs possibly as much as 30 billion euros now. The EU is not even in a position to fully bail out its own members, its southern European indebted countries. Is the EU really going to put 30 billion euros into Ukraine now? Freedom of movement, huge issue within the EU at the moment. Even member countries are rebelling against the true possibility of opening their borders to southern EU members. Is that going to happen vis-a-vis Ukraine? It sounds great what Alexander Bar has outlined for us, but frankly, it's completely infeasible.
Well, me too. I don't believe that this will happen. By the way, we will have the elections to European Parliament on the same day as presidential elections in Ukraine in May. These elections to the European Parliament, they're a big danger for the European Union at the moment, because we see radical parties in many member countries who actually have this agenda, an agenda of stopping migration to the richer countries of the European Union. So with the European Union having these very serious inner conflicts, it will be very hard for the European Union to solve the problems of the Ukraine now. What we can see in the last days, what I would like to add, is also the factor of the US. As I understand it, the US are much more pragmatic at the moment. The Deputy Secretary of State came to Ukraine yesterday with a number of economic advisors, and they will work with the new Ukrainian government on institutional reforms, economic reforms. So what we see now is the European Union is trying to figure out a strategy, and meanwhile the USA is already working with the new government.
I suspect that those advisors are there, among other things, to find the stolen money. We know that Yanukovych put away large amounts of money for himself, his family, and his cronies. Irina Solonenko, I know that you've done some research on the role of the oligarchs. Tell us something about the role of oligarchs in regard both to the fall of the Yanukovych regime, but also now to filling that huge financial hole. They've got a whole lot of money. Shouldn't they be the very first ones to ante up here?
Well, I think large-scale redistribution is a dangerous notion. You know, this is it will push oligarchs really away from trying to stabilize the situation. And I think it's not a good idea, basically, redistribution. But what we need in Ukraine is the rule of law.
So no 75% tax on the capital of the oligarchs.
That's a different issue. You know, you can take away their property. That's not a good idea, right? Maybe we draw a red line, and from now on we start working within the rule of law, within the same rules of the game for all economic subjects, not just oligarchs, but also small and medium business, yeah. So that's an idea now. But what the EU should do, there are a lot of bank accounts in the EU where Yanukovych, his son, former prosecutor general, other people who are were close to Yanukovych, who were directly involved into violence, and they have bank accounts in the West, and I think that you should investigate this. It's not something extraordinary. There is an anti-money laundering directive of the European Union. There are FATF regulations. It's just for the banks to follow up on EU legislation, basically. But of course, there should be some political push for the banks to do that, and that's what has to be done. And then, of course, I mean, now all these residences of Yanukovych and other people were discovered. I mean, people knew about them before, but now they became open for public as well. And people see what kind of luxurious buildings these are, how much money it costed to make curtains or to paint the walls or something else.
State money.
This was state money, absolutely. So maybe you can use now this money also to stabilize it, to help Ukraine economic problems.
But meanwhile, Kiev has a huge financial gap, and we've seen predictions the last few days, Alexander, that the country could run out of money in the next couple of weeks. 30 billion euro price tag for a bailout, that's what they're estimating at the moment. Could that go even higher if Russia, for example, were to take punitive action like raising the price of its gas exports to Ukraine or perhaps imposing tariffs? And do you think Russia might take such a step?
Absolutely, if we are in the worst case scenario, if we still continue with our geopolitical battles in Ukraine. Therefore, my appeal again, and a lot of people here in the German government, including even Ursula von der Leyen in the NATO headquarters a couple of hours ago, said that even NATO has to talk to Russia right now. We should avoid the same kind of front building as existed before, because in my view, my humble view, the West cannot help Ukraine alone. Russia can help. China should invest in Ukraine. Ukraine should be open to everyone. I agree with you that there should not be an expropriation of Ukrainian oligarchs. The oligarchs have basically played a very important role during the Maidan Revolution #2. They, at the end, convinced Yanukovych to stop violence as well. Pinchuk did this, Akhmedov did this, a couple of other oligarchs were very much involved in trying to solve the situation in a modest way. I think that the problem of Ukraine, as I see it, it's not that we're simply changing people now. The new government may be a government of honest people, but the system is, excuse me, very corrupt. And what we have to do from the European part is to involve ourselves in changing the system, because if we will not change the system, the Ukrainians have to change the system, but we can give the right advices for them to do it. If we do not do this, then let's see, then the situation will be completely different, in my view. Then maybe Western-oriented oligarchs like Yulia Tymoshenko, who ruled the country before, will build her own oligarchical system in this country without any change, and then Maidan will wake up in a couple of weeks and months and say, what did we do here?
I want to come back to that point in just a moment, but very briefly, if you would, please, because you've made a very impassioned plea twice now for us to bring Russians in. You wrote a book some years ago called The Cold Friend, Why We Need Russia. Are you satisfied that your government, the German government, has sufficiently realized the need for Russia to be part of the solution and taken the right steps? Certainly we've seen Foreign Minister Steinmeier issuing some very clear pronouncements on that subject. Yesterday he issued a joint statement with the Russian foreign minister, a rather unusual step. Are you satisfied your government's doing enough to promote that kind of constructive cooperation with Russia?
Yes, we have a change in the Russian policy, but also an Ukrainian policy since we have a new government here, because the former government were a little bit blind on seeing the perspective of wider Europe, of engaging also Russia in solving general European problems. I think we need a Europe without dividing lines. I'm really passionate about this because we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the break of the wall, Berlin Wall, this year. It should give us some kind of sense of what Europe is today and where Europe could be in a couple of years again. We don't need to have new walls. Some partners, as I said, are very difficult. Russia is a difficult partner. It will never become like Poland or Hungary for the European Union. But still, we are on the one continent. We're in the same house. So we have to find some kind of modus vivendi to work or coexist with them as well for the benefit of all.
So let's talk about what the new house in Kiev could look like. The transitional government and further down the road, upcoming elections. Moritz Gutmann, how integrative is the new government that was announced this week? Are you convinced that they can bring the country together?
I would say that this new government is widely controlled by people of Yulia Tymoshenko. It has some
Just
people
labeled by Alexander Ra as a Western oligarch, Western-oriented oligarch.
Well, Tymoshenko is also in favor of the Russians. She has quite a good relationship with Putin, so she's playing the game. She's actually, that's what Tymoshenko is. So to come back to the government, I would say it's widely controlled by her party and by her people. We have some people from the Nationalist Party. We don't have people of Klitschko's party in this new government. So actually yesterday it was presented to the Maidan Square, and there are no oligarchs in this government. There are no people from the former Party of Regions, so from the former regime. So actually this is an acceptable government, I would say. But what we should understand that this government will be in a very, very difficult role now. The country faces huge problems. And so what we might see is that this government will be removed after only 2 or 3 months, maybe after the presidential elections in May. And the government that will come after this one, that will be the government and the prime minister who will control the country over the next years.
Moritz Gutmann, a brief word on the right-wing nationalists whom you mentioned there. You were on the Maidan. There's been a lot of controversy in general, even here in Germany, about the degree to which right-wing nationalists played a role there on the Maidan. What was your impression? How numerous were they among the protesters?
I would say that the longer that the Maidan stood, that the demonstrations took place, the bigger the role of the nationalists became. That's what I would say, because the normal people, the 100,000, 200,000 people, they left Maidan, and what stayed on the Maidan were people who were ready to fight, ready to actually sacrifice their lives for this revolution. And in this group, I would say that the nationalists played quite a big role. So nationalism was certainly an integrative factor in this revolution.
Irina Solonenko, let's link all this now to that very dire financial problem that faces the authorities in Kiev. To what degree do you think that they can make the kind of very tough economic reforms that have been discussed for years in Ukraine and not carried out? And I'm thinking here about the fact that the IMF would be, of course, a potential source of funds to fill that financial gap, but the IMF froze its last loan to Ukraine because the government was not able to make those kind of reforms. Tymoshenko, in her years at the helm in Kiev, she also did not carry out those kind of reforms. Is there any reason to think that the transitional government, or perhaps those who will run for election in May, are any better able to do that?
Yes, I think so. Actually, this government, you rightly pointed out that some parties are excluded from it, like the Party of Regions and Udar Party. But I think it was their conscious decision not to participate in this government. And they want to run elections, presidential elections. Klitschko, the leader of the Udar Party, he wants to run for presidency in May.
Of course, the charismatic former boxer who was on the Maidan.
That's true. And then parliamentary elections, the new government will actually be formed after the parliamentary elections, not the presidential elections, according to the new constitution. election. And I hope, as far as I see, the people in Ukraine, they don't want to wait until 2017. That's where elections are supposed to take place, but really to have early elections. So this government will be in place, I don't know, maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years if we have early elections. And parties who have political ambitions, who want to run campaigns, they're not there, I think, for the reasons for themselves. They decided not to do so. And what we see in this government, some people who are not have no political agenda. For instance, the name which was named for the Minister of Economy, Pavlo Sheremeta, he was a consultant in Malaysia and he helped to carry out reforms there. And he's an economist professional. He studied in Harvard and other universities. It's the first time we see a person like this in the government, and that's very positive. And then the Minister of Healthcare, he was the coordinator of the medical service at Maidan. He has no political agenda. He was appointed, or he's supposed to be appointed, the Minister of Healthcare, and so on. So we see this kind of people, and I think they understand that they will become unpopular because they have introduced painful measures for IMF, to get an IMF loan in particular. But I think they're prepared for that. Not all of them are professionals, but nevertheless, yeah.
I would like to add that actually for a real reset of the country, of the political system, we need parliamentary elections in the near future. Yeah. Because actually this parliament, it consists of the same people who 1 month ago mainly supported Yanukovych, and the people who left the Party of Regions. It was 60 or 70 people over the last few days. It's not real politicians. It's people who are puppets.
And they are elected. Come on. They are elected.
They are elected, but they are ready. But they are ready to go to the party that controls, that has the power, and that is a real problem. So you actually need new people, and this is also
are there better politicians out there if parliamentary elections were to be held soon? Irina Sononenko, would Ukraine get a better group than it's had in the past?
I agree with Alexander on the point that we need to change the system, and elections it's important for elections to be carried out according to the new rules. What we need is open party lists, and we need a proportional system. This is the best system which can bring people to the parliament which represent certain societal cleavages. So that's what we need. Just parliamentary elections without changing the system, no. But in this way, yes, absolutely. And just a point on nationalist moods. Actually, Svoboda Party, which got into the parliament in 2002, its support reduced significantly after the protests. Many people who voted for Svoboda, they voted as a protest vote. They just didn't see, it was a kind of a new political force in terms of that they never been in the parliament before. And some people just wanted to bring some fresh faces into the parliament. But there's no many people in Ukraine who support nationalistic agenda. And if you look at people who died at Maidan, these 20 years old guys, if you look their personal history, they're not nationalists. They were businessmen, they were students. I think this notion of nationalism is a bit exaggerated from my perspective in the West.
Reading between the lines, Alexander Rar, it has sounded very much like Europe would more or less like to wait to take serious action until a new government is elected in May. Catherine Ashton has been quite cautious in many of her statements, also mentioning the IMF, but of course, again, their IMF loan possibly dependent on reforms that definitely are not in place yet. So what do we do in the short term? What needs to happen to bridge that financial gap? You mentioned Russian support. Russia has also cut off its payments to Ukraine. What is a potential short-term solution that could bring the country back from the abyss?
But we have to agree with the position of the European Union and of Russia in this case. Why should Russia or the European Union give money to Ukraine if this money again comes or will arrive at the foreign, some kind of bank accounts of certain oligarchs who are now more pro-Western oriented? We don't want this. I think the system has to be changed. And I don't think that the Ukraine can afford to have a government which exists only for a couple of months. They need a government of trust. They need a government to whom the East and the West Ukraine, the younger and the old ones, should be looked upon. And we have taken influence in Ukraine during the Maidan revolution. We, the West, the Russians less, but before that Russia had more influence. So we can't say from one day to another we wait and see what happens to this country. I think there are moral obligation to do more. If the Americans are now in with their advisors, I would suggest that the Europeans do the same. Mr. Steinmeier, our foreign minister, has suggested many times to organize an OSCE conference where Russia is also full member, like America, like Germany or France, to discuss the situation, how to help Ukraine. This may be the measures to do.
I'd like to add one thing to the question of economical reforms. Why Timoshenko didn't enhance these reforms, neither Yanukovych. One of the issues is, for example, the gas price for normal Ukrainians. The big financial problems of Ukraine are partly because of this issue, because they buy the gas at one price and they sell it to the Ukrainians at a price that is much too low. So one of the steps must be to actually make the price for the gas higher. But most of the Ukrainians, of course, will not accept this because the economical situation of them is really bad. So there's a big question if the new government will be ready to do this.
Irina Solonenko, almost out of time, your prognosis on where your country will be 6 months from now, a year from now?
Well, I see now a lot of positive steps in the direction of stabilization of the situation. Crimea is still under question, but what concerns the rest of Ukraine, I think we're on good track. This government is really a compromise government, although some parties don't participate, they already announced they will vote for it. I hope new elections will be scheduled, parliamentary elections. So far, I see we're on good track, but of course a lot of risks remain, and we are waiting for the more proactive role of the European Union.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.